I'm Miley Wong, Senior Portfolio Manager and Senior Wealth Advisor with the Wong Group at Wellington-Altus Private Wealth. And I'm very excited to welcome you all to today's very interesting conversation on the topic of beyond borders, scaling your business and investments globally. And it couldn't be a better time to have this conversation with all the things that are going on. But taking a moment to reflect on the past year, it's been a very eventful year as well. And I'm pleased to say it's been a good year for our client portfolios, despite navigating a very challenging time, both geopolitically, with interest rates and inflation and all the uncertainty and market turmoil. But nonetheless, investors like you have been rewarded by just staying the course and trusting the process and resisting the temptation to jump out and do something that might be against your best interests. So I wanted to thank you for trusting the process, trusting us to help you navigate these tricky times. So what will 2025 bring? With all of us as business owners or investors thinking about the global and geopolitical landscape, how do we position for the year ahead? Well, that's precisely what we're here to address today and help provide some actionable insights and strategies on how to build sustainable global expansion. And also to help you just gain some greater understanding about what's happening in the world around us and to integrate a smart global perspective into your investment strategy and also your business decisions. A couple of months ago, I had the privilege to attend a very important business and trade mission in Taiwan and Vietnam as part of a delegation of 30 Canadian businesswomen who were hosted by the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, a leading global think tank that specializes on Canada's relationship with Asia. During this trade mission, I had the opportunity to meet with many business leaders, CEOs, ambassadors, and the Vice President of Taiwan herself, Ms. Xiaobi Kim. And we had some very interesting conversations around semiconductors and artificial intelligence, the military impact of China and the integrated geopolitics surrounding the Taiwan and South China Seas Strait. We talked about how to build resilience considering heightened military concerns as well as the new American president in the White House. These are global issues and ones that can impact economic decisions, social and ethical decisions, and have real human impact. So how should we, as business owners or investors, think about these topics and how to integrate them in light of all the geopolitical landscape and think about positioning for the year ahead? And so to address these questions, I'm so pleased to invite you into a conversation today with our very special guest, Ms. Vina Nadjibulla, Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Vina is a specialist in geopolitics. She brings with her a very impressive background spanning over 2 decades of experience in high-level diplomacy, strategic planning, policy analysis and program management, and a focus on political risk analysis, conflict prevention, women's rights, peace building, and global governance. Vina is an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia, a senior research fellow at the Sufin Center, which specializes in global security and foreign policy, and she holds a master's degree from the Columbia University in New York. She spent how many years in New York, Vina? 13 years in New York. Vina's recent research has focused on hostage diplomacy, Canada-China relations, and Canada's engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. She's a highly sought after in the media and is a leading voice on geopolitics, Canadian foreign policy, and Canada-Asia relations. As an international security specialist, she spent a significant portion of her career at the United Nations headquarters and in peacekeeping and peacebuilding missions in West and Central Africa. She also has extensive experience working with national governments, nonprofits, and philanthropic organizations in Canada, the US, Central Asia, and China. Welcome, Vina.
Thank you so much, Miley. That was so generous, and it really is an honor to be with all of you today. This really is a conversation because I don't have any of the answers, especially in the current moment, but probably some good questions and things to point out and to speak through together.
Brilliant. Maybe we'll just get started with a bit about your role at the Asia Pacific Foundation as the head of research and strategy and some of the things you've been focused on recently.
Sure. Happy to. And of course, Miley mentioned that she's on our board and she has a very important function of actually managing the board's endowment. So we also trust her with our money and our salaries and everything else. So you couldn't be in better hands. So that we have in common. Beyond that, I lead our research and programs team, which means I have a small team of about 27 really dedicated scholars who are looking at Canada's engagement with the Indo-Pacific, so the part of the world that kind of spans India to all the way to Japan, down to Australia, and also includes Latin American Pacific side. So about 40 different countries. So it's a big part of the world. And of course, Canada has been looking into the Pacific and engagement with Asia for many, many years. The foundation was established 40 years ago by an act of parliament with the foresight that for Canada to continue to be a prosperous country, we need to engage not just with the US and Europe, which historically had been our closest allies and partners, but also look west. So 40 years ago, some folks like Jack Austin, a senator from here, had that foresight, and never has that idea or that message been more relevant than now for a variety of reasons, both because of the opportunities that stemmed from the Indo-Pacific, but also because of the flashpoints and the tensions that could also ignite and have a tremendous impact on us. So that's what I do. I basically look at, 40 countries is a lot. So to be honest, we look really primarily at 12 jurisdictions much more closely. So India, Bangladesh, and South Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, a little bit Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, so the VIPs. In Northeast Asia, we kind of have to cover all of them with the exception of Mongolia, which we look at a little bit, but not as much. So it's Japan, South Korea, primarily, as well as Taiwan and China, of course. And as I mentioned, Australia is part of our jurisdiction, but there are many other actors who get Australia, in part because we've looked at Australia less as kind of being in the Indo-Pacific or in the Asia-Pacific, but more as part of kind of our regular Western alliance structure, if you will. So the competence on Australia, the engagement with Australia is higher. Therefore, we are not sort of as in demand when it comes in on explaining or sort of facilitating understanding and exchanges. And in terms of the type of work that we do, it's everything from analysis to convening of events, to organizing trade missions, to hosting policy dialogues, especially on more tricky relationships. So in the past year and a half, I've spent a lot of my time on India, not surprisingly, given that our bilateral relationship with India, which is the most populous country in the world, is at its lowest point. We have this new Indo-Pacific strategy, but the Indo part of that strategy has been really struggling. So I spend a lot of time on India. Similarly, obviously, our relationship with China, while better than it had been in, let's say, the period of 2018 to 2021, is still in a difficult spot. So China, and it's less about kind of understanding the domestic politics of China, trying to make sense of the Communist Party, CCP leadership, or the Politburo. It's much more about making sense of China as a global actor. Because even if you say, you know what, I'm not that interested in China anymore, it's too complicated to do business there, well, China is everywhere now. So if you're interested in Southeast Asia, you're interested in China. If you're interested in Europe, you're interested in China. If you're interested in Canada, you're interested in China. So you can't run away from China, it's everywhere. So we need to, at the very least, understand China as a global actor and as a regional actor, if not sort of dedicate our waking hours to making sense of the increasingly darker black box that is the actual leadership and the party state in Beijing. And then also, most recently, to my surprise perhaps, I'm spending a lot of time on South Korea as well. That was sort of one relationship, the South Korea-Canada relationship, which was on an upswing. And if we had this conversation in November of last year, I would have been really sort of bullish, saying it's a fantastic relationship that's going to go places. And of course, like it often is in geopolitics, boy, did things really change in a span of essentially sort of 6 hours when President Yoon of South Korea attempted to declare martial law, and then there's now a deep political crisis, which we can speak about because, in fact, the reason I was so optimistic about Korea in November is because so much has happened. There's a lot of investment, a lot of trade, a lot of work together that we're doing with Korea on multiple levels. And there's complementarities when it comes to energy security, when it comes to our demand for markets for our agri-food and everything else. Korea is an opportunity, but the politics of it is complicated. So that's probably the longer answer that you were looking for, Miley. But that's what, and of course, most recently, I can't not say this, but like everybody else since November, also preoccupied with what's happening in the US. Because as much as obviously our day job is about making sense of Canada-Asia relations, Canada's closest relationship is that with the US, and everything else that we do in the world gets colored through that lens. I'm relatively new to Canada. In that long bio that Miley generously read to you, you probably made connections that I've only lived in Canada since 2018. So I've been a Canadian for about 6 years. And very soon after kind of arriving and making Canada home, I realized that when it comes to Canada's foreign policy, because that's my line of work, I've spent the last 20 plus years looking at foreign policy, international relations, Canada basically has kind of a three-legged stool. The most important leg is the US relationship. The second leg is diaspora politics, dealing with all sort of the areas of the world where Canadians have an interest. So be that India, be that China, be that Ukraine. And then the final leg is sort of multilateralism, or the pet issue of the day, depending on the government. So it changes between the liberals and conservatives, but it's kind of everything else, sort of the icing on top, the whatever project, feminist foreign policy for the liberals, kind of priority on religious freedom for the conservatives under Harper, right? So, but the most important leg of that stool is the US relationship. And if we don't understand that, then it's hard to make sense of the other two. So I'll stop there.
No, it's brilliant. Thank you, Vina. So as you mentioned, US politics. Why don't we start there? It's kind of topical with the inauguration just yesterday. Can you share with us your insights into the relationship between Canada and the US with Donald Trump as the President of the United States of America?
Yeah, and I'm sure everybody in the room has views, right? That's one of those questions, Miley, where if you gather 3 people, you'll have 5 opinions kind of thing. That's definitely one of them. But and probably you already are tired of hearing words like uncertain, unpredictable, messy. Those are all the things that people use to describe. Unorthodox, I think, I like that. Sort of unorthodox makes it sound a little bit less sort of negative in terms of what's happening in the U.S. Again, as I mentioned, given that the U.S. is our most kind of central relationship, both from economic integration that has happened over the last 30 years, as well as given that the U.S. provides us with a security umbrella, changes in how we see that relationship will have profound implications, right? Trump won. I think a lot of us, while we were shocked, we still felt that maybe it was something that was a deviation from the norm, sort of a shock event. We need to survive 4 years, and then things will go back to some kind of a normal. And for all of the criticism of President Biden, which we can all elaborate on, but there was a sort of a return to normal, at least in tone and rhetoric, prioritization of allies. Biden did a lot to kind of talk about U.S. leading the world as the world was changing. There was a recognition that the order that had come about after World War II was changing and transforming, but there was still a narrative that the U.S., with its closest allies, Canada, Japan, Australia, will try to work together to shape the new order that's coming, right? Whereas with President Trump, I think the most interesting element is that he's not interested in working with others to shape the order. It's not even really clear he's interested in shaping the order. I think what's coming out is that he's interested to take advantage of the chaos and the disorder that's unfolding for sort of very specific sets of interests, right? So it fundamentally is changing how the U.S. has positioned itself on the world stage from kind of a leader of the world, however imperfectly. From Vietnam to 9/11, there were moments where U.S. obviously could be accused of hypocrisy and double standards and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, it was projecting a moral vision for a type of world it wanted to create. And it had a set of allies, Canada, possibly first among many, who were ready to help U.S. in that endeavor. And to be frank, we as Canadians have benefited profoundly from the world order that the U.S. had created in terms of our prosperity, We have a seat at many of the tables, like the G7 group, NATO. We kind of punched above our weight, if you will, at least by the membership cards that we carried. We didn't often use that well, our membership, but at least we were in the room, we were at the table, and were given a voice, which you can't say for many of the other places, like Brazil and India and others, that are challenging the world order in part because they want much more equity. So anyways, long story short, Trump doesn't necessarily want to lead. He's not interested in alliances. When I listened to his inaugural speech yesterday, he didn't say the word alliances. He didn't say the word friends. He didn't talk about global leadership. He didn't talk about common goods such as climate. He didn't even mention Ukraine. He didn't really mention Middle East. He only talked about hostages and being the incredible deal maker that he is. And then with respect to sort of kind of global issues, I mean, you got a sense that there was a need for isolationism, protectionism, and mixed into it for some of us, a bit surprising, is imperialism. So this idea that the U.S. will expand its borders that came in the speech, most notably with respect to Panama Canal and Greenland, and then to some extent Canada, right? So I think this is where not only are we now living in a world in which our closest ally is not willing to lead in a way that will benefit us, we're also in a world in which our closest ally now may think that fuller integration, not just economic integration, but political and diplomatic integration is also what needs to happen, because you need a fortress North America. Canada has to be kind of subservient to Washington in its position, and then you have spheres of influence. So we're back to kind of 19th century world order. So, I mean, we're in the 21st century, and we'll talk about all the things that are shaping 21st century, like AI and amazing technologies that are going to fully transform how we live, and yet political leadership that's being offered from one of the most powerful countries in the world is one of 19th century. Great power competition, power politics, spheres of influence, mercantilist international trade policy in terms of tariffs and protectionism. So it's quite an interesting juxtaposition to try to behold and try to analyze as an analyst. And of course, mixed into all of that is that sort of this notion that President Trump thrives to kind of create some kind of a method in the madness, that unpredictability or sort of this ability to change his mind is actually by design. We'll see how that actually plays out, right? But it does make our jobs much more difficult as analysts or as people who are trying to offer advice to those like you in the room who need to make real decisions about how you invest your money, the kind of business that you will do. We lived, and I certainly began my career and my work at a time when economics, business interests were paramount. Geopolitics had taken a back seat. Sort of right after the Cold War, it was an anomaly in human history, in modern history certainly, where we didn't have to worry about great power competition. We could really all focus on the idea of maximizing prosperity, maximizing globalization. The era of hyperglobalization was a period where I sort of started to work on these issues. And we're now in a very different world, and nobody could have predicted how quickly that all happened. So for Canada, that means our privileged position where we could basically coast and do just enough and benefit from kind of our geography, from our history, from our alliances. That period is over. If we thought we had a little bit of a runway because the decline was slow, it's a cliff, we're falling off, we got to figure out what to do. And that means invest more in our statecraft. That means invest more in our own areas of strength. Energy comes to mind, food comes to mind, research areas around quantum, AI, space comes to mind. So we have to be much, much more strategic. We need to have the same mindset that countries like Singapore have had for their entire modern history. They didn't have the privilege of kind of having safe, benign neighborhoods. They had to develop statecraft. They had to learn how to create trade-offs, how to bring the public with us, right? So our leaders now need to be communicating the very hard choices that are facing Canada. And instead, of course, we have a different situation on leadership, so we can talk about that as well. So I don't want to sound negative, so maybe let me, before kind of I make everybody feel really depressed, just like it's gloomy outside, I'm originally from Central Asia. I grew up in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. My mother is Soviet Jew, my father is Afghan. So basically my mother's people had invaded my father's people. I was a child. It was complicated, is basically what I'm trying to communicate. And so from that early age, because of that personal biography, I've had an approach to crisis that genuinely does include opportunity as well. So there are many things that now are changing, and we can either be afraid and wish nostalgic for bygone times, or we can say, okay, this is a crisis. This is a moment of complete reimagining of how the world operates. How can we take opportunities in that, right? Like, so geopolitics, everybody's now talking about how geopolitics is the greatest risk. Well, it's also an opportunity. So everything, as you know, in business, with risks also come opportunities. So there's tremendous amount of opportunity in reimagining and building something that's going to be more equitable and that at the end will work a little bit better. So that's where the green transition comes in. No matter what President Trump does on, withdrawing from Paris Accord or whatever, there's a business case that's out there now for renewables, for green energy that will be hard to erase. No amount of deregulation and slogans of drill, baby, drill will change the simple dynamics that renewables are now cheaper in many parts of the world, and people want it. They want it because they can see the impact. And it's not ideological, it's simply it's natural disasters. So if you look at Southeast Asia, Philippines is the most prone to natural disasters country in the world. It's an archipelagic nation of 7,000 islands, and they get a lot of natural disasters. They want to be able to transition to cleaner energy. They don't want to burn coal. They don't want to burn LNG and everything else. Of course, for a short period of time, for the next 30 years, we still need it. This is not an argument against. It's just more that there are now market dynamics at play, and we can reverse them with executive orders.
Speaking about danger and opportunity, I love how you touched on that. That's actually a key concept in my book, Smart Risk,
which I'm looking forward to read. I have a copy now.
And the opportunity of this technological advancement that we're all living through. And maybe we can touch upon how artificial intelligence and the advancement of technology is changing the landscape for geopolitics. Can you talk about the risks and the opportunities that AI and technology in particular are having today?
Yeah. So on AI, for the last 2-3 years, to the extent that there were kind of global conversations that I've been party to, they focused a lot on AI safety. So this idea that we need to develop guardrails, we need to figure out how to regulate AI. And that's why we had big summits in the UK on AI safety, and then most recently in South Korea. And my team and I sort of covered what that means both for Asia, but also for Canada. What's interesting in the current moment, Miley, and this predates President Trump, and we can speak a little bit about his impact on AI. But even before President Trump, the pendulum was shifting a little bit towards AI action and innovation and harnessing the possibilities of AI. So people were beginning to say that our discussions on safety are important, but there are a couple of dynamics. One, not everybody's on the same page. So while European Union was regulating, perhaps over-regulating, as some would argue, and there was a kind of push to move in that direction, other markets in Asia were not. They were focusing much more on utilization, commercialization, adaptation, and asking the questions on how do we deal with the impact on the workforce, right? So how do we make sure that we are reskilling and skilling and protecting the sectors that might be going out? So there are many questions you can be asking on AI, and the questions that have been dominating a lot of headlines and big conferences until this year had been on safety and AI safety, and sort of including at the military domain. The one thing that President Biden and President Xi agreed to late last year was on limiting AI in the military domain, right? We'll see whether that agreement holds. But what I'm excited about now, especially for a place like Canada, is to talk about utilization and what AI can do to raise our productivity, right? Like one of the things that Canada in particular struggles with, and this is not news to anybody in this room, you know this far better than I do, is productivity. I mean, and we have tremendous ideas. For the number of years, Canada was number one on AI research, right? And it's not just AI research, it's also quantum. And we have tremendous talent in our universities. But we don't then move to the next step of saying, so what do we do with this research when it comes to business, when it actually comes to growing our economy and to moving ourselves up the value chain from just supplying the world with raw commodities to actually manufacturing something and putting something out there and retaining that talent here. So that if you're somebody who's a young person with great ideas, you don't have to go to the US, you don't have to move to Singapore, you can actually have a prosperous business here in Canada. So that's where the conversation is moving now. Interestingly, the AI summit that's being organized now in France in February, just next month, is even renamed from AI safety to AI action. And that name change is significant because people are moving in that direction. They're sort of saying all the kind of the apocalyptic scenarios that people like Yuval Harari, if you know him, he's a historian out of Israel, they speak brilliantly on kind of the threats and the existential threat that AI is to humanity and to how, what it means to be human. And as someone who loves to write poetry and enjoys poetry, I appreciate what people like that say, that we do need to maintain our humanity and what does this all mean to kind of the fundamental notion of what being human means. But I'm also excited about the opportunities that are coming up. So in Canadian case, notwithstanding our political leadership issues, which we can come back to, but we are hosting the G7, the group of 7 nations this year. A key topic for us is AI. And looking specifically at kind of AI's impact on our economy. So which means, and I believe this will be transition-proof if we have an election and new government. The investments that were made in 2024, the billions of dollars invested into compute as well as research will continue. And where Canada is trying to position itself, in addition to our top-line research, is also powering AI energy. So we're back full circle to energy. And interestingly, especially for those who are older in the room, you would note that there was sort of a period where nuclear was kind of all the rage, and then we sort of went through a different phase. Well, we're full circle back. Now everybody talks about nuclear energy. It's kind of amazing. Some kind of switch went off, and now, like, every meeting I attend to, there's a lot of discussion about nuclear and Canadian technology, as well as modular reactors, SMR, smaller modular reactors, which we don't yet have, but want to be able to position ourselves in that market. So on AI, data centers, powering AI, that's kind of where Canadian advantage would be if we can manage to put the right regulatory framework. And that's a big if. And this is where a potential change of government could be helpful, in part, even if they don't wish to do so for ideological reasons, they may need to do so because the US is moving in that direction. And one of the biggest differences in Trump 2 from Trump 1 is going to be the presence of big tech in his coalition now, right? So his tent has gotten much larger now with the presence of all big US tech companies. How long that kind of bromance lasts, we don't know, because these are big personalities with very unique characteristics and ways of relating to the world and to each other. But for the moment, that is a very powerful alliance that will lead to quite a bit of deregulation and a much faster speed in which US is going to be moving on this. And Canada, as long as we are integrated, which we are for the moment, will need to keep pace. Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly AI and semiconductors and these very high-powered chips have been a very positive investment theme in our client portfolios over the past years. And we are seeing the opportunities to broaden beyond that towards productivity, as you highlighted, which is so interesting. And it really parlays into some of my conversations when I was in Taiwan with the vice president of Taiwan about security, production of these very high-quality chips that are required for processing this very, sophisticated artificial intelligence. And Taiwan Semiconductor, being one of the global leaders that produce over 90% of the semiconductor chips that are used in the most advanced technologies, is a company that is become relevant from a geopolitical standpoint as well. So maybe we could touch a bit on how we as Canadians should think about the risk between China and Taiwan and how that impacts not only technology, but us as business owners and investors as well.
Absolutely, happy to. And TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, kind of has become a household name in part because of the book Chip Wars. I don't know if you've read that. It's amazing how, again, similar to nuclear technology, sort of during COVID with supply chain disruptions, we all became experts in semiconductors and kind of these foundational technologies. it really is interesting. But Taiwan and TSMC is uniquely positioned in that sense because of what you mentioned. Partly foresight of the government of Taiwan. In the 80s, Morris Chang, he tried to set up businesses in the US and in Europe and elsewhere, but it was really Taiwan government's industrial policy at the time that essentially led him to establish his base in Taiwan. And basically by kind of in 2-3 decades, they develop a monopoly for all practical purposes, even though there are others in South Korea and Japan. But when it comes to the smallest chips that we need for the most advanced technologies, it is TSMC. That's really the only game in town, which is kind of amazing given that Taiwan is also one of those flashpoints that I mentioned and has been for a while when it comes to relations with China and also obviously US-China competition and its impact on Taiwan as well. So, I mean, regardless of kind of how we make sense of what President Trump will do on Taiwan, it's an issue that just from a business perspective, you wouldn't want all of your semiconductors coming from an island that is a potential flashpoint. So in the last few years, there's been attempts to diversify. So TSMC has been encouraged, pressured, whichever way you want to look at it, to open up fabrication facilities in Japan, as well as in Arizona and in Germany. But even with all of that, the process is really slow. And at best, over the course of 5 to 10 years, we'll get to a position of 75% of them are produced in Taiwan rather than 90 or 99%, right? So yes, there will be a little bit of diversification, but for the moment, we need to make, so there are many arguments for why the status quo in Taiwan needs to stay, why we need to have peace in the Taiwan trade relations. There are many reasons for that, not least of which is the 24 million people live on the island of Taiwan. And so obviously for the sake of 24 million people who live on Taiwan, we need to maintain stability, but we also need to maintain stability because of the value of Taiwan in the global economy. We simply, there have been studies done, especially by one of my favorite think tanks, the Rhodium Group out of New York, who look at the cost to the world economy of even just a blockade of Taiwan, right, which is in trillions. I mean, we've seen what happens when there's flashpoints in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine. The impact of an actual kinetic activity in Taiwan or Taiwan Straits would be devastating for the world economy. So in some ways, because it's just so concentrated, everybody's invested in maintaining stability on sort of across the strait as well as on Taiwan Island. Now, having Donald Trump as the president makes kind of predictability and stability much harder because it can go either way. He has an administration that's full of what we would describe as China hawks. Senator Rubio, who's just been confirmed for Secretary of State, Mike Waltz, who's the National Security Advisor. These are diehard China hawks who sort of believe in the long-term rivalry, competitive relationship with China. However, we also now have obviously the tech community, Elon Musk chief among them, and we have the president himself who is not seeing the world in such conceptual terms, right? President Trump doesn't wake up like a lot of Biden's team and talk about sort of the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, maintaining deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. That's not how President Trump views things. He views things much more from a deal-making and a transactional perspective. And there is a scenario, it's a non-zero chance, not a high chance in my view, but there is a scenario in which some kind of a grand bargain can be struck with China with respect to Taiwan, which would be then disagreeable to many other interests in the U.S., which then creates and would be disagreeable to the current government in Taiwan, which is obviously much less friendly towards Beijing and then has agency as well. So they're an actor and they can do things. So all of that to say that is the one flashpoint in the region that the lights have moved a little bit closer to red than they were before, I would say, President Trump.
Interesting. So speaking about flashpoints, and let's talk about the trilateral relationship between China, Canada, U.S. Can you highlight some of the latest developments within China policy? And what do you think are the intentions behind some of their policies with respect to doing business in China for Canadian and U.S. multinational companies? And in particular, are companies like Costco Apple, Microsoft? Is it safe for them to do business in China?
Sure. I mean, again, so we can answer this question before Trump and now, right? So if we had this conversation in October, I would be talking about things that are changing in China, the laws that China is bringing to bear that are making it harder for Western companies to operate, and which is leading companies to either essentially kind of do two things, either leave, which is for some, or create separate businesses. So China-only businesses and then Western businesses, right? Which means separate everything. So back-end separate documentation, the whole thing. And then, of course, they were also taking advantage of sort of shifting of supply chains to Southeast Asia, right, where you're creating a China plus one. So you're not really decoupling from China, but you're moving to these connector states like Vietnam, Mexico, Malaysia, and others to be able to diversify and slightly de-risk your business. That was kind of the trend. And of course, a number of other things sort of in terms of just harder to travel since COVID. So that was kind of more the picture, that the costs of doing business in China were increasing for reasons of China itself rather than anything external. That was before the current moment. Now we're in a moment where you can sort of start to ask questions about all of those assumptions. And I have no answers, but the way I'm trying to make sense of it is I'll be paying attention to a couple of things. One is to what degree President Trump himself is going to want to kind of lead the China policy, and to what extent he'll let his team kind of fight it out among them. Because as I mentioned, there are different equities in the coalition or the people that he's assembled. So to what extent kind of Trump himself is going to want to have an early meeting with President Xi, travel to Beijing, try to make some kind of a deal on trade, try to make some kind of a deal on Ukraine and Russia, sort of solicit President Xi's involvement in that and a post-ceasefire Ukraine. So these are questions, and we don't yet know the answers. We have some early signals. So the call that they had this past week before the inauguration, the sort of the gestures of inviting President Xi to the inauguration, right? So, and the fact that he's very involved with TikTok as a deal maker, and as a result, some would argue, and I tend to agree, is postponing the announcement of tariffs on China to be able to kind of have some deal making on TikTok in particular. And then sort of see so in the next kind of few weeks or few days, we'll need to watch to what extent President Trump will be himself involved in the China policy, or to what extent his priorities will be elsewhere, right? I mean, he can't be involved in everything, so we'll need to figure out quickly, in addition to his domestic priorities of emergency on the border, emergency on energy, deregulation, and kind of all the anti-woke stuff, what else is he going to prioritize? If he prioritizes China himself, then we are in a period of extreme volatility in the relationship. So you can have high peaks and high valleys, right? So, which is the worst in some ways because you really can't understand it, but you have to be extremely agile as a business person, as an investor, and kind of be able to take advantage of the opportunities and also kind of manage the risks of that. If he is not involved, then you really are going to see quite a bit of sort of confused policymaking, some tightening of some things when it comes to export controls, AI regulations, in terms of not selling chips and technologies to anyone other than 18 countries that was announced under the Biden administration. Everything in the kind of the Indo-Pacific region is restricted trade on AI and AI technologies. So if he's not himself involved, then it'll be much more volatile. All of that to say that for Canada, under Biden administration, it was really easy for Ottawa to basically fully align with the U.S. I mean, even the EV tariffs was an indication of that. We had consultations nominally about the thing, but it was predetermined. It was one of those, U.S. has 100% tariffs, our auto sectors are fully integrated, there is no option, we need to move in that direction. U.S. wants to talk about economic security, U.S. wants to talk about export controls, we have to fully align, let's do that. Now, even if Ottawa wanted to fully align, it would be really hard to figure out align to what. So policymaking in Ottawa now has become really complicated because if your formula was, we're fully with the U.S., well, where is the U.S. at the moment, right? Like, how do you make sense of what they're doing and how do you kind of disaggregate what's happening on tariffs on one side, what's happening on TikTok on another side, what's happening in personal diplomacy and deal making with Korea or Ukraine on another side, what's happening on AI on another track, right? Like, these are now going to be many different policy lines of effort that will have different people potentially leading them, and some of it is going to be conflicting with each other and working cross-purpose. So for a country like Canada, we need to be much more thoughtful, much more strategic, rather than just kind of blindly follow.
So given our lack of leadership currently in Canada, maybe we can take the track back to domestic politics. And you were just back from Ottawa last week, or this week, I think.
On the weekend.
On the weekend, okay. Well, thank you for coming back from Ottawa for this. And maybe you can share with us some of the insights and the latest prognostications of what you think is going to be taking place here in Canada.
I think it's much easier to talk about China than it is to talk about Ottawa right now. It's funny, when I travel to the region, I spend 50% of my time on the road, as Miley knows. And when people ask questions, it's often harder to talk about your own country. Like, I'd much rather, when I'm visiting Philippines, talk about South China Sea and everything. The minute they sort of say, well, help us make sense of Ottawa, it's like, oh, must I? I really don't know how to make sense of it. I mean, what I can share anecdotally, because I did spend a week and kind of all over in meetings, there is a sense of panic. I mean, you really can feel it. People are panicking. I think tariffs obviously is kind of the tip of the spear, and so much of our conversation has been focused on these tariffs. But we need to be looking at things much more foundationally, and this is way bigger than just the tariffs. I mean, it will be an economic hit, but we can survive that. A complete reimagining of our relationship with the U.S. and our place in the world as a result of that, that's a much harder thing. And it's really hard to do if you have leaders in all parties, in government, as well as politicians, who have spent their whole careers living in a world in which U.S. was the closest friend and ally. Yes, U.S. did things that annoyed us. Yes, we always kind of disagreed, but we were family. And in family, you can have a bad Thanksgiving, but you're still family. You're stuck with each other. You kind of, you can criticize each other when you're together, but when you're out of the house, you defend each other. You have each other's back. I think that was really the relationship. And if that's not it, and it's not just not it for the next 4 years, but that's it. Like, the U.S. is fundamentally different. And even if there is a swing again and you have a Democrat, we can't go back. We can't unlearn and unknow and unlive what we are living through and will continue to live through for the next 4 years, right? So, and to my surprise, unless I kind of missed those war rooms or those places, back rooms where people were having a real conversation, that's not happening, right? Like, you need basically not just someone who says, how do we survive the tariffs, which is an important line of work, and the whole team needs to be dedicated to that. Then you need a team that's basically has a whiteboard and is looking at everything. Like, everything is back, all assumptions that we have, everything from kind of our energy policy, our international posture with all the international organization, our trade agreement, our alliances, right? So, and that's the exercise that's currently not happening. So enough people are kind of running around trying to make sense of tariffs, but nobody's sort of saying, what does this mean much more fundamentally to how we're to conduct ourselves in the world, right? And if we need to increase our defense spending, it's not just about hitting that 2% number, right? Like, everybody's running around saying we need to hit 2%. If you gave all that money right now to Department of National Defense, they couldn't spend it. The procurement is completely broken. They can't spend the money. So it's not just about writing a check and saying, as Canadians, we've all agreed we need to spend more on defense because the world is a more dangerous place. Our defense industrial base is completely atrophied, right? Our procurement system doesn't work. So it's a much bigger challenge. If we said tomorrow, you know what, we have all these fantastic trade agreements. We often brag about the fact that we have the most free trade agreement of any other G7 country. But the utilization is so low. So even tomorrow, if we decide and said, you know what, we're selling all of our stuff on the global market, we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the ports. We don't have the pipelines. We don't have the railways. We don't have even the people to manage all of that, right? Like, our ports are already unregulated. Like, I mean, there's basically no policing of our ports. So that's not there either, right? And this is basically, it's the kind of thing that we should have done 20 years ago, but better late than never, right? So we now need to be having those conversations, right? And that's where I think, as much as our political leadership right now is in transition, in decline, in whatever way we want to describe it, this is where we need business and civil society to come forward. Because in the moment where the political leadership might be weak, we need the rest of society to step up. And business has a really critical role, because this will impact all of us, right? I mean, of course, a lot of Canadian big multinationals have the option of just relocating to the US. A lot of our small businesses don't really have that option, right? So somebody needs to kind of look out for that. But again, if I were to really try to put kind of a positive on it, we will have a new government at some point this year. That automatically means the pool of talent in Ottawa will increase. What we've seen for the last 10 years is the same set of actors have been essentially leading the country, right? And no disrespect to those people. A lot of them I know, they're lovely, dedicated humans, but nobody can work at full speed 24/7 for 10 years. It's just humanly impossible, psychologically impossible. These are very demanding jobs. And naturally, when you're in government for that long, your circle of trust keeps getting smaller and smaller. Your capacity to hear new ideas kind of atrophies. You're in this hunker down mode of political survival, and it doesn't allow you to hear anything that doesn't already confirm what you believe. So if nothing else happens, we'll just have new people, and they will make new mistakes, and hopefully they'll also have good new ideas, right? So I am optimistic in that sense, that it's not about which party you support or not. We just need new blood, new ideas, and new way of thinking.
How can Canadian business owners or investors either contribute to the solution or, on the other side of the coin, build resilience to be able to survive this uncertain environment where there's political change both here and around us?
Yeah. Resilience is another sort of big word. And in fact, just for Christmas, I got myself a gift of poetry called Constellations, which is by David White. And he explores the meaning of everyday words. So like resilience, hope, courage. And resilience is one that I've been kind of meditating on quite a bit for the last few months, because everybody wants to have more resilience in their personal lives, more resilience in the country as a whole, more resilience in business, right? But what does that really actually mean, and how do you get it, right? That's like one of those, we want it, but we don't know how to have it. And like everything else, it requires discipline and work. So in our personal lives, that essentially means maintaining psychological poise. How do you maintain psychological poise? I mean, we all are familiar with those habits that kind of allow us to do that, right? Like quiet time, meditation, exercise, good diet, right? But that's not a given. You have to do it and you have to work at it. Same thing with businesses, right? Like, I mean, so much of what we did before, we were able to take for granted. This incredibly friendly big market to the south, right? Where we didn't have to compete globally. Like, I spent many months, I wouldn't say years, because it's really only been like about 36 months of trying to convince Canadian businesses to look to the Pacific and to do business in Southeast Asia or elsewhere. And until recently, until basically November, the businesses would tell me, why? It's so much easier to do business in the US, right? So it's almost saying it's so much easier to sit on the couch. Well, of course it is. But, what if something happens to this couch? What if something happens to sort of the comforts that you're in? Wouldn't it be nice to have some muscle memory, some skill set of going outside of the house, and which would be, in this case, going and looking somewhere else? So what I'm trying to say is that to build resilience, you have to be comfortable with a certain level of discomfort, which is not a nice thing to hear. Like, you have to grow accustomed to being uncomfortable, to being challenged, to going outside of your limit, to being outside of your comfort zone. You don't build resilience by maintaining comfort. And this is, again, no disrespect. I love Canada. I'm choosing this as my home. But there's a level of comfort here that was an incredible privilege on a global stage. And this doesn't apply, obviously, to new Canadians like me, lots of immigrants who don't. It applies to people who have had the privilege of living in a comfortable, safe, amazingly rich place that is Canada, that we love. But now, because the world is changing, because Canada is changing, because the US is changing, we need to become uncomfortable before we can build resilience. We have to learn to take risks. We have to learn to make mistakes. We have to learn to have courage of our convictions to actually try something outside of the comfortable, outside of the US market, and experiment. And bring in new voices, bring in people who are maybe slightly outside of our traditional comfort zone. So again, there's no formula to kind of resilience beyond you have to build for contingencies, you have to be adaptable, and you have to figure out how to manage discomfort, how to learn from mistakes, how to fail often and have a relationship with failure that's very different than the one we have.
It's
Does
very
that
good.
help?
Yeah, it's very good business, but also life advice.
Like it always is. All of these things are related. Like geopolitics and poetry to me are the two sides of the same coin. So I kind of, my two passions, basically. Question that goes to the heart of kind of how do you have a clear-eyed view of the world so that you're not kind of naive to the threats and the reality, but also then are able to focus on the areas where you have control. So we need to be realistic and clear-eyed about the threats and the changes that are emanating now from the US. But the solution needs to be exactly what you're saying, investing in ourselves, relying on our own strength, figuring out who we are as a country, what we stand for, what are we willing to invest in, and kind of moving from that position of strength. But it is both. Like we can't pretend that the threat doesn't exist, in part because it's happening and it's real. But I completely agree with you that the conversation needs to then move from panic, which I was describing as occurring in Ottawa, to kind of a smart, strategic, calm, sort of here is a pathway that will get us out to a better place, taking advantage of this crisis to build something that is much more resilient, that there's that word, that is much more capable to withstand shocks rather than overly dependent on one country, however friendly and however historically linked we are to them. Russia is a dying empire that's trying to maintain relevance and is broadly a disruptive rogue state in a sense, right? Like Russia is acting without many constraints. China is an emergent power. Re-emergent is the right word because it used to be a global power. It's in a very different place in terms of its own view of its place in the world, kind of much more optimistic. I mean, I don't know what happens behind closed doors, but publicly there's a lot more optimism and dynamism in the speeches and the messaging that you get from President Xi. That's not the messaging from Vladimir Putin. And while Xi and Putin have a personal simpatico, they like each other even though they don't have a shared language. They speak through an interpreter, but they genuinely have a good relationship. I mean, I speak Russian and I've lived in Soviet Union, so I follow Russia and Putin quite closely, and I lived in Beijing for a while and follow that. So Russia-China has been a relationship I followed for 15 years now. And we are at a moment where the two are very linked because they share certain interests and certain objectives. But there's still a lot of historical people-to-people and other tensions that exist. This is not an alliance. This is a marriage of convenience. It has a timestamp on it. Eventually, it will run the course when sort of shared objectives are no longer binding them together. So we would need to really look at Russia and China very differently. I don't believe, I mean, anything can happen. So tomorrow Putin can have a heart attack. I mean, everything can happen, but I don't believe Russia is on the verge of collapse. I think, yes, Russian economy is struggling, but it's on a war footing. And as you know, and those who've lived through wars, for the short term, when you're on a war footing, you actually see some benefits. Like standards of living have risen in Russia amazingly, in part because of all these death benefits and injury benefits that the average population is getting. I mean, it's tragic to say that, but 1 million Russians who've died fighting this war in Ukraine, their families are getting money from the state, therefore the economy has been growing. I mean, and there's a lot more to it as well, but and China obviously is helping as well. So I don't believe Russia will collapse. I think we will see efforts to make a deal on Ukraine, which President Trump has signaled, which President Zelensky has signaled, Putin and even Xi Jinping, right? So I think we will see some movement in that direction. I think you're raising interesting questions. What happens the day after? So let's assume there's some kind of a ceasefire in Ukraine. Let's assume hostilities end and we're sort of in the next chapter. What happens to Russia's relationship with China? What happens to Russia's relationship with DPRK, North Korea in particular? And what happens to kind of Russia's overall engagement off the coast of Alaska, off the coast of Japan, right? So to what extent Russia will continue to escalate and provoke if sort of the Ukraine issue is settled, right? And as for China, I definitely don't believe China is going to collapse anytime. I think with Russia, there is some questions because it's very much a personalistic dictatorship at this point. I think President Putin has been in power for so long, has centralized power so much that there could be questions as to what happens after him, right? Whereas with President Xi, I don't believe that it's just about him. I feel like the institutions of the Communist Party in China are much stronger right now, and the system will produce a new leader, and much of the direction of travel of China to become sort of a great power, to be self-reliant, to be this fortress that is protected from the West will continue. Now, I say none of this because I think that's necessarily good for ordinary Chinese citizens or for the world. I'm just describing this analytically in terms of my perceptions of sort of the state of the party. In part because, and this was something that I was noting when I was also living in Beijing, it's increasingly difficult to organize. And this is where technology comes in. This notion of people's revolutions that we've lived through and that we still sort of aspire to is very difficult in techno-authoritarian states. The system of state surveillance is so pervasive and goes to, and it's through sort of regular everyday activities of buying things. This cashless society that China has become is helping with the surveillance. Everything that you do now is on your phone and fully monitored. It's very difficult to organize. Yes, you will have protests and people who follow, and I follow this too, could show kind of localized unhappiness with the local governments, with the regimes and whatever. But by and large, A, it's incredibly difficult to organize, and B, the level of national pride, nationalism, patriotism in China is very high. And the more the external environment becomes chaotic and unstable, the more people rally around the flag, the more they rally around their leader. They, again, kind of the descriptions I was making about the family. You can criticize within family, you can be unhappy about your day-to-day issues. Youth unemployment is really high, property market is crashing, consumer attitudes are really negative. I mean, the list goes on, right? Economically, China is in a more difficult situation now than during Trump 1. But sense of national pride is high. So I don't imagine a collapse anytime soon. Again, famous last words of any analyst, right? But the best you can do is sort of analyze what you're looking at now. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And it's hard to answer that definitively. I mean, this is just personal opinion, right? And there are probably many other people who are better positioned to answer it. And also many political leaders that we need to be asking that question of to get their vision for how they're going to work to maintain Canada's sovereignty and independence. My own view is that yes, if again, this is completely a personal view, I feel that we need to be able to kind of meet the threats of President Trump with defiance. I mean, again, from my own personal biography, I don't believe you give in to bullies. The playground, just remember your own childhood. When you acquiesce, when you concede to a bully, you just encourage them, right? I mean, bullies are ultimately cowards at heart, and you have to stand up to them. I mean, it's like, again, I'm not a psychologist, but it's a behavior of weakness. It's not of strength, right? People bully out of fear, out of weakness, out of sort of narcissistic personality, out of those things. And the response to that has to be firm. You have to stand up. This goes back to resilience. Standing up has costs. It's not cost-free, right? So there's no scenario in which we can withstand this without some costs. And therefore, do we have the strength? Yes. Do we have the leadership? I don't know. Do we have the conviction? I hope so. 80% of Canadians want to be independent. 20-some-odd% feel like integration with the U.S. is not a bad idea. So just going by those numbers, I feel that we do. But it's not going to be straightforward. I mean, we have to exercise a lot of smarts. We have to figure out kind of how to listen past the noise. Like there's a lot of noise, a lot of, as you were mentioning, there's the volume on everything has been turned up. So we just kind of need to go back to basics on some things, right? So, and see where we can apply asymmetric leverage, where we can work with others. So again, playground dynamics, right? Figure out the weakness of the bully, stand up to the bully, find friends, know what price you're willing to pay. And sometimes, like, you can say one thing to the bully, but do something else. Again, we need to also learn to have more sophistication in how we operate. We don't have to put all our cards on the table. What we're doing a lot in the last few months is not only kind of preparing for Canada's change of leadership, which we started to do last year, but now also dealing with Trump. So again, to what I was mentioning, there is no version of Canada's engagement in the Indo-Pacific that doesn't have to take into account Canada-US relationship, right? So we're spending a lot more time making sense of what's happening in the US, making sense of what that means for our relationship with Asia. So if you just go on our website right now, you'll see 4 publications that basically address that from different angles, right? So kind of Trump's Asia policy, impact on Canada, sort of our diplomatic relations, our business relations. So we'll be doing a lot more of that. I'm spending a lot more time in Ottawa, and I'll be going to Washington in March after I spend a month of February in Asia, precisely for that reason, is to sort of figure out how can we contribute to this national conversation that's now beginning to happen in Canada with the groupings like the Business Council, with the various trade association, auto sector. There's now a coming together of some civil society groups. We're trying to figure out what we can bring to the table, given our mandate and our expertise, which has been very much about Asia focus, but now how do we bring that to bear to make sense of Canada's overall foreign policy in the context of a changing U.S. relationship? Does that help somebody? To answer the question is we are now, like everybody else, trying to make sense of that question first and then see what the impact is on our overall relationships. Yeah. Again, this is a personal view. I don't know if I can't offer anything other than personal view because there's no definitive answer to that question. But I mean, what I'm seeing, obviously, and watching it, not just most recently kind of in his support to President Trump, but I thought that the defining moment for me in understanding Elon Musk was when he purchased Twitter. Because until then, I sort of saw him very much as this amazing business person, entrepreneur. I kind of, like everybody else, followed SpaceX a little bit, right? And sort of this idea of new frontiers, and I admired what he was able to do as a business person. The purchase of Twitter and sort of the kind of the non-business case for it, and the purchase of it as a public square and as a tool of political influence was interesting to me, because then it started to get into my area of work, right? So now I think Elon Musk basically wants to be consequential leader on the world stage. He doesn't want to just be a business leader. He doesn't want to just be an innovator. He doesn't want us just to go to Mars, which I think still is very much a personal commitment, but he also wants to influence politics on Earth in a way in which no other business person, at least to my knowledge, has attempted to do. There have been coalitions of interest in certain sectors. There are very powerful lobbies and individuals, and other billionaires have exerted influence. Nobody's attempted to do it in this way, using the technology that social media is now offering him, and being so direct and kind of organized about what he's doing, right? His support in Germany for the far right, his meddling in politics in the UK, his meddling in politics here, obviously his influence in the US. This is something we haven't seen before, where kind of billions, technology, and sort of personal convictions come together in such a powerful way, because I do believe he's a very capable individual, very smart, very dedicated, very mission-driven, and he currently has a mission that is not just about changing our relationship to space, but changing the planet we live on in ways that maybe many other people wouldn't agree with. But he has an outsized influence. I believe that influence will continue at least for a period of time. I'm not of the view that the relationship will crack soon, because I think both parties understand the fundamental value that they bring to each other, right? So President Trump is very capricious in his favor and relationships, but I think he also understands that Elon Musk brings some real things to the table and has real leverage. And so both parties will kind of attempt to sort of modulate their extremes, so they will continue to kind of try to coexist and co-lead in some ways. So yeah, I think he'll have an outsized influence. On some levels, it'll be good. So I think on kind of regulations and some business policies, especially if you are of that persuasion, you'll see a lot of changes. So there's a lot of optimism also in the U.S. tech sector at the moment, and I think that's because of this influence. If you are someone who really cares about the public square or the sort of the political freedoms of countries, sovereignty, who doesn't like the rise of populism and far right, then you would be very concerned watching what's happening and the influence. But it is definitely now a new factor. So in the way that technologies now shaping how we live. We also have very powerful individuals who are now controlling those technology platforms, who are choosing to be engaged in politics in the way that we haven't until now. Great question. And I think a question that many are asking, because under first Trump, we saw countries like Vietnam in particular emerge as the winners of kind of the changing supply chains and the China plus one strategies. And Vietnam definitely was well ahead of Malaysia, even well ahead of Mexico. And they became known as connector states. The question now is, will that trend continue with those countries? Or because they have developed these huge surpluses with the US, will they also become a victim to tariffs, right? So that's an open question. And of course, Vietnam and Malaysia and others are doing everything they can to make sure that they don't get impacted by tariffs, but we don't know. If there are no tariffs in those countries, they will continue to grow, and there's still a lot of opportunities. And in Vietnam in particular, 2024 was much more of a politically unstable year where we saw a lot of political transition. 2025 will be stable, and in 2026 we'll see leadership change, but it's been baked in, so the volatility was in 2024. So I think you will actually see less sort of domestic factors in Vietnam that were hindering them taking full advantage of it, but they were still a front runner because of the external environment. So now, if the external environment remains favorable to Vietnam, they are better positioned internally to take advantage of that, so they will continue to be a leader. But that depends on the tariffs, because they also have a huge surplus with tariffs. And Vietnam is interesting for Canada because they're a member of CPTPP, so we have a free trade agreement with them. So in a lot of Canadian companies, we're also expanding there. Now, Indonesia is a slight latecomer to this party, but of course has a lot more to offer. And Canada just signed a free trade agreement with Indonesia at the end of last year. And Indonesia, President Prabowo, under the new leadership of Indonesia, is positioning himself to kind of both sort of in the US camp and in the China camp, and is the fourth largest country in the world. I think they have a lot more leverage to be able to kind of manage the US-China competition. So it's harder to do business in Indonesia, in part because it's, again, an archipelagic nation really spread out. From one end to the other, the distance of Indonesian islands is the distance from Paris to Kabul in Afghanistan. That's how long the country is. So you don't think of Indonesia in that way. We often think of Indonesia as really populous, but it's also very spread out. So, and there's kind of, each island has its own unique dynamics with respect to business environment and cost of labor and all the rest of it. So, but Indonesia is an area to watch because I think even if things get really dynamic, shall we say, or hairy in terms of US-China competition and trade wars, they'll be able to kind of maneuver that relatively well. I think Malaysia is another place to watch, but there's many more challenges, especially if things between US and China don't go well and not stable, then Malaysia is actually more vulnerable because Vietnam has a lot more capacity to manage China than Malaysia does in some ways because of their history. I mean, actually, I mentioned Singapore earlier when it comes to statecraft. Vietnam is excellent as well. I mean, they're communist party, but run communist state, but they know how to manage great power competition. So, but Malaysia is another one. In terms of newcomers, lots of conversation about India, but it's very challenging. So India will never, even though in size it's the same as China, it can never become a China for a variety of reasons because of their own issues around education in terms of the workforce, because of infrastructure, because of technology. Also, in some ways, this is good from a democracy perspective, less good from ease of doing business perspective, but India is federated, kind of like Canada, and each state has their own regulations. And so it's fantastic from kind of dynamism, pluralism, and democracy perspective. It's harder to make sense of doing business in India. So India, you almost have to look at individual states, like where in India are you able to work and kind of the networks that you have. But still, I mean, there's opportunities there as well if we're able to kind of manage our political dynamics with India, but obviously to watch. I think the real question is, will there be new connector states like the ones that emerged? And I struggle to kind of look at the geography of Southeast Asia or in the Pacific and come up with those other ones, right? Like, I mean, Philippines, no. I mean, even though they have a 6.7% growth in 2024, but they were nowhere near being able to take advantage of the China plus one in terms of energy costs, in terms of, again, labor. They're doing a lot when it comes to kind of the the movement of services, but then AI comes into that. And so much of it, especially around voice, like all the call centers and everything that are moving to Philippines, well, they will be the first line which will suffer with automation and AI, right? So what does that do then to Philippines? I mean, there are lots of questions about that. Kind of what's a surprise country that, I mean, Thailand has issues, both political as well as economic. I'm trying to think. I mean, obviously Singapore will continue to do well, but it's a different ball game. Yeah, so I mean, you kind of are stuck with the same set of issues. And also the interesting thing is, I mean, we've been saying a lot of kind of negative things about what's happening in the US potentially with respect to Trump, but US still remains the most dynamic economy in the world, right? I mean, especially coming out of COVID, like nobody could have anticipated the kind of growth the US saw. And in the long term, maybe what President Trump will do will be damaging, but in the short term, US will remain the most dynamic market. This is the sad reality of it. So no matter what we do, diversification, we're still living next to the most dynamic economy in the world. What the US has been doing, both in terms of AI, both in terms of kind of the emergence from COVID and the recovery post-COVID has been remarkable, right? So China will continue to grow, but at a much slower pace. I mean, then we just saw the numbers that came out. Official numbers said 5%. Rhodium Group said somewhere between 2.4 and 2.8%. Although Rhodium Group is more optimistic about 2025, thinking it's more like a 3.6% growth. So China is an opportunity, but really look at China now more for China, right? Like you're looking at China for China and also maybe a little bit in the region rather than kind of for the global market, for those who are global and in Canada. Does that help?
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Vina. Some key themes that I heard you share with us today are, one, the importance of building resilience, and that's a daily practice in life of business and not being afraid to, exercise those muscles and build them for when you need them, like times like today. Yes. Secondly, the idea of danger and opportunity. Yes. Right? While there's, doom and gloom out there, there's also opportunity. And I think nowhere better is there an opportunity to look at that than from an investment or a business standpoint. And, thirdly, that there are opportunities for Canada to really emerge as a strong country out of this, with the opportunity with new leadership coming in, perhaps, and really this is forcing us to think about reinventing ourselves as a country when we look at the instability around the world, quite frankly. But there are lots of reasons to be positive. Yes. And, we're also grateful to be living the lives that we live, and to be able to gather today to hear from people like yourself, Vina, who have such tremendous insights and background. And thank you so much for your generosity of sharing these insights. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to all of you in the room, I wanted to thank you for taking the time and your open-mindedness to talk about these tough concepts today and really grapple with these and not be afraid to hear the truth and the insights from behind closed doors, and to be able to make informed business decisions going forward. And, thank you for your trust in our process. This conversation just demonstrates the level of quality conversations we're having with our team and other policy analysts and portfolio managers and professionals globally to tackle these issues and help make better decisions on your behalf and really stay on the leading edge of knowledge. And this is all fun for us, and we really enjoy it, which is part of our craft. And we so appreciate your willingness to be able to be a part of this journey, so that we can continue to deliver performance that delivers peace of mind and to be your stabilizing force during times of turbulence. Thank you, Vina. Thank you all for being here today.